Ben Goldfarb investigates road ecology in his latest book, Crossings. From major highways to remote backcountry trails, from Brazil's giant anteaters to caribou migrations in the Arctic, he's traveled far and wide to document a global problem that has unraveled over the past century and a half. We talked about the history of roads, wildlife's winners and losers, how would you change things with a time machine, peak roadkill, and the craft of conservation journalism. We spoke on the phone in December 2023.
Are there any old military roads you would visit in a time machine?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think that if I had a time machine, I would actually want to go back and see what some of the animal trails that crisscross the continent looked like. That's where a lot of our contemporary roads came from, right? They were animal trails, often created by bison, which migrated in these enormous herds. That became native footpaths, that became wagon roads, and then gravel roads, and eventually interstate highways. And I guess I would love to go and see some of those pre-colonial animal tracks crisscrossing the continent and really the world. I mean, it's not just the U.S. where animal trails became road networks. That was true of elephants in Africa as well. And I would love to see some of those giant bison paths that became the basis for our road system.
Can you say something about maybe where is that most directly obvious?
Yeah, there are some highways in the kind of the southeast, Missouri, Tennessee, the Natchez Trace Parkway. That was originally a bison trail that bison created to a salt lick. There are these big naturally occurring mineral licks that animals regularly visited, to get some of the nutrients they needed, and you get these big herds moving through and creating again these really consistent, predictable game trails across the landscape. And I think that one chapter of the book actually deals with road salt, which we apply in enormous quantities to our highways as a de-icing agent. And I just find that kind of fascinating and ironic that historically, animal trails made these pathways to salt licks, so that the highway itself actually followed salt in some ways, and now the salt follows the highways as we apply just huge volumes of this stuff as a de-icer.
In your travels, was there a place that kind of gave you a glimpse into the past and to how much of a problem mud used to be?
Funny you mentioned that, because that is I'm glad you picked up on that. I mean, that's a big part of what made roads so transformative, especially for wildlife. Is as we figured out how to pave these objects. First with gravel and clay and other sort of low tech surfaces, and then eventually, of course, with asphalt. That was what permitted the speeds that turned roadkill into an enormous ecological crisis. And certainly you can see vestiges of those old dirt roads, especially in our national forests and other forms of public land. In U.S. national forests, we have close to 400,000 miles of road, and the vast majority of those are dirt roads, old logging roads and firefighting roads and ATV trails. This enormous network of unpaved roads, and I've driven thousands of miles of those things over the years. High lakes and trailheads and fire towers, laying public lands, and certainly some of those are pretty treacherous, right? You get these crumbling cliff faces where a dirt road is just sort of like eroding off into the abyss, and certainly incredibly muddy spots where you're constantly at risk of getting stuck. And so, I think if anybody who wants kind of a sense of, early or maybe like late 19th century roads, that Forest Service road network, which was mostly built, starting in the 1920s, is a really good place to start.
If you were sent back in a time machine with the goal to slow down the spread of roads, what would your plan be?
That's a really good question. I think that really what creates the explosion in cars. I mean, there are a few factors. I mean, first, a lot of it is Henry Ford, right, and his kind of cheap mass production techniques that really democratized, the personal automobile and made it very famously affordable to his own workers. Originally cars were sort of these upper crust machines that Vanderbilts drove around in, and the kind of the cheap Model T is, I think, a lot of what leads to that kind of exponential growth in car ownership that you're describing. So that's part of it. Part of it is certainly the sort of the desire for recreation, right? That really the explosion of cars isn't necessarily that cars are so useful, although certainly they did have utility. I mean, it was really that they were kind of liberating, right? You read about like in the late 19th century, nobody had ever heard of a vacation. The idea that you would sort of like leave your town to go somewhere to enjoy the countryside, that was just basically unheard of, unless you were among the ultra wealthy. And that's a big part of why cars become so popular, is that they were liberating in a sense, and allowed people to go see the countryside and travel a bit. As for how you sort of prevent that, it's a really good question. I mean, certainly, cars very deliberately, kind of overthrew, more traditional methods of transportation, like the streetcar. I mean, certainly that would be one point of attack, I think, if you wanted to prevent, the total automobilization of the United States, would be sort of preserving the transit options that prevailed before cars took over cities. And then I think the other important point is that we just have so many redundant roads. That's another thing that we could have prevented at one point in human history. Maybe is the fact that we just had the fact that you can get to literally anywhere, and not only by road but like by many different roads, right? That like so many different. I mean, there are just these vast spider webs of really redundant roads that that cover the continent, and I think if you could prevent some of that redundancy, we really could have avoided a lot of ecologically harmful road construction.
Do you get the impression that animals today have like better cognitive models of roads than, say, a random sample from 200 years ago or 2,000 years ago?
It really depends on the species, right? I mean, certainly there are obviously animals that are incredibly adaptive and flexible and intelligent, and clearly know what roads are and know how to navigate them. In the book I talked about, the very famous urban coyotes in Chicago, who look both ways and use crosswalks at the appropriate lights. They're incredibly well adapted. They're very famous crows in Japan, who use cars to crack their nuts. They'll place a nut at an intersection at a red light, wait for a car to drive over it, and then scurry out and grab the nut meat. So obviously, there are animals out there that have these incredibly sophisticated cognitive models of roads, as you put it. So that's certainly true. But there are also animals that are not as adaptive and flexible and creative. And I'm not sure that a spotted salamander today has any better sense of what a road is than a spotted salamander 200 years ago, which is why you see such high amphibian roadkill rates, because they're just these are incredibly ancient and maybe objectively not all that intelligent animals who just sort of like blithely walk into traffic on their way to their breeding ponds, and really don't have much sense of the road being potentially a deadly force. So it really just depends on the species you're talking about.
That's right. Vladimir Donetz is a zoologist, and he was telling me that he's observed a Cooper's hawk that waits at a street light, and he waits for like the beeping for the pedestrian crosswalk to go, and then a few cars stack up, and the Cooper's hawk makes like this low approach into a park, kind of using those cars as cover. And
fascinating. Yeah, interesting.
Did you study geese at all?
There's not much goose content in there. I mean, certainly, like one story that I did hear from a few different people is that they love new growth, right? New grass is why you always see them, kind of like picking along soccer fields. And oftentimes, after roadsides are replanted or after mowing, they'll kind of end up colonizing roadsides, and they do get hit. I mean, look, it's of course flying is helpful, but lots of birds get hit by cars. Something like 300 million a year, and so I mean especially geese, which are these kind of big-bodied birds that take a little while to achieve liftoff. They're definitely at risk, and I mean that goes for lots of different birds. You mentioned the winners, who the animals who have benefited from from road construction. I mean, certainly, scavenging raptors come to mind, right? I mean, you've got, golden eagles, bald eagles, turkey vultures, black vultures, all do pretty well along roadsides eating carrion. That Cooper's hawk story, which is really interesting, is definitely, sort of indicative. I mean, you've got lots of, barn owls, for example, who hunt along grassy roadsides, tend to have lots of mice, red-tailed hawks. I mean, certainly, there are lots of of scavenging and predatory birds who have kind of learned to use these landscapes. But again, they're dangerous places, right? And if you're a golden eagle who's just been feeding on a deer for 20 minutes by the side of the road, and you attempt to achieve liftoff, right? It takes you a while to get going, just like a Canada goose. So you're vulnerable to hit as well. And so, these roads can really turn into ecological traps, right? They've got, they have resources to offer that lure animals in. And in some cases, wildlife can benefit, but obviously, living alongside the road is a really dangerous place to be.
In addition to the danger of a collision, there's also road noise, which you dedicate at least one chapter to road noise, and it sounds like maybe one of the worst impacts of road noise is on birds and their ability to hear danger and maybe hear prey like insects. And what are the consequences of road noise for birds? And could you maybe speak about foraging vigilance trade-off?
Yeah, definitely. So that kind of section of the book comes from this really ingenious and famous study called the Phantom Road Experiment that was conducted a few years ago by researchers in Idaho. And basically what they did was just record the noise of traffic, and they played traffic noise through speakers in this otherwise roadless forest in Idaho. And what they found is that lots of birds avoided that area, and the birds who did kind of stick around in this phantom road of noise were in worse body condition than other birds. And again, the hypothesis there is that, look, if you're a bird, and these are these migratory songbirds who are flying enormous distances, right? You have to be feeding constantly to maintain your body weight and energy levels. And so they're normally constantly eating beetles and berries and other foods. But if you're living in this kind of swath of road noise, you have to constantly be alert to predators, right? Ordinarily, you could hear predators coming. Maybe you'd hear, a hawk's wings, or you'd hear, the bobcat creeping through the underbrush or whatever. But, if those subtle noises of approaching predators are drowned out by, all of the road noise, then you have to look for predators instead of listening for them. And every minute that you as a bird are looking around for predators is a minute when you're not feeding, which is why birds who were exposed to this phantom road were sort of in worse body condition, because they couldn't they just couldn't feed as much because they were constantly searching for predators. And so I think that's something that we kind of forget about sometimes, right? Is that that noise is really this form of habitat loss in a lot of ways, right? That if you're a bird who has to constantly look for predators because you're living near a noisy roadside, maybe that's not a place that you can live, right? Or if you're a predator yourself, imagine an owl who has to listen for the sound of a mouse's teeth in the leaf litter or something like that. I mean, if that noise or that sound of your prey is drowned out by engines and tires, then again, that's not a place that you can hunt. And so, a road itself might only be 50 or 100 feet from shoulder to shoulder. And yet this noise pollution issue, that noise just kind of like billows away for, in some cases, a couple of miles from the roadside, and just casts this enormous shadow and really changes the lives of all of the critters who live near it.
During the pandemic, we saw restaurants kind of reclaim parts of city streets for outdoor dining. And it was kind of a stark reminder of how much public space we surrender to cars. And also the reduced traffic was less noisy. Do you think that that moment in time will have an effect on infrastructure policy?
These little outdoor curbside cafes, that have really replaced what was formerly parking, and people love that stuff, and so it stuck around after the pandemic, right? So that's a change. A lot of the bike lanes that were put in, lots of cities from Paris to Rome to London, sort of very aggressively acted to add bike lanes and reduce car capacity, and a lot of those changes have stuck around, and there are cities from Cincinnati to Tampa, cities that you wouldn't necessarily think of as being like great mobility leaders, who closed traffic on certain streets and turned areas into pedestrian plazas, and those have stuck around too. So just to some extent, I think some of the changes that we saw during COVID have proved durable in the long term. But I think that writ large, our society is pretty similar now that as it was in 2019. Certainly traffic rates remain mostly unchanged, and it's not like we saw we saw sort of lots of little changes, I think, but we didn't see any dramatic changes in how people get around. So I don't think that we overhauled society and transportation exactly because of COVID.
Yeah, that's fair. It's funny how quickly things go back to the way they were. What do you think is the best thing that's happened in road ecology? Was it Dombeck decommissioning 2% of Forest Service roads?
The best thing that's ever happened? Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know if there's a single great thing that's happened. Certainly, that roadless rule that that was created by the Forest Service, under Mike Dombeck, which protected a lot of areas from road building. That was a big deal. Go back to the Wilderness Act, in 1964, right? This giant piece of legislation that protected just enormous swaths of roadless wilderness on public lands all over the country. Certainly that was really transformative. That action wasn't necessarily taken for wildlife, right? That was really taken for almost spiritual reasons. All of these wilderness advocates who wanted to protect this untrammeled land mostly for their own recreation purposes. But certainly that the creation of our wilderness system was hugely beneficial to animals like grizzly bears and wolverines and lynx and other species that really require these large intact habitats. So I think that's a big deal. I think that's the increasing movement towards the construction of wildlife crossings is a big deal as well, right? All of these overpasses and underpasses and tunnels, all of these structures that allow animals to safely cross roadways that have been built and are being built on I-25 among many other places. I think that's had an enormous impact and has really mitigated a lot of very problematic roadkill hotspots out there, especially in the American West, where a lot of these structures have been built. So I'm not sure that there's a single transformative event in the history of this field. I think it's more like we've done lots of things that have helped wildlife, but at the same time, I think that the trajectory is generally in the wrong direction, right? That yes, we're protecting roadless places and building wildlife crossings, but we're also building a crap load of new roads all the time, not just in the U.S. but all over the world, and traffic rates are going up on existing roads as well, which makes them much more of a barrier to animal movement. And and we're learning that tire particles are a gigantic problem that are killing salmon all over the Northwest, right? So we're doing things about the problems that roads create, only getting worse. And, we're also learning about how bad the problem is constantly. And so, I think that, most of the trend lines, unfortunately, are going in the wrong direction.
If you close a Forest Service road, say in Colorado, how many years do you think it takes to kind of disappear into the surrounding wilderness, or does it always kind of leave a mark?
Well, it really depends on what happens after you close it, right? If you one of the big issues with all of those Forest Service roads is compaction, right? You've got decades of logging trucks and ATVs and other vehicles rolling down these roads, and so the soil is incredibly hard and compacted. And as a result, if all you do is just put a gate up in front of that road, it's still, the road does not return to nature for decades if ever, because the soil is just so hard that it's really tough for plants to take root there. Really what it means to do this work well, is do the work of road closure and decommissioning well, is to get back in there with in some cases the same heavy machinery that built the road in the first place, right? Excavators and front loaders and stuff, and and backhoes, and just tear that roadbed up, loosen the soil, create a little bit of micro topography that plants can take root in, do some some reseeding of vegetation as well. When you do that, when you really churn up the roadbed, then it's it can be incredibly effective. I've definitely visited decommissioned roads that were closed in the 1990s and early 2000s, and Idaho and Montana especially, and you'd have no idea that there'd ever been a road there if you weren't looking for it, which is pretty cool.
If humans disappeared overnight, even decades later, there would still be signs of highways that were buried under grass. They wouldn't return to just being like undifferentiated from the wilderness without actively breaking up the underlying soil.
I think when it comes to like our major interstate highways, I think you could go back. If humans disappeared tomorrow, you go back in centuries or millennia and still know that there's been a highway there. There's actually a good book called The World Without Us by Alan Weisman that sort of proposes exactly that thought experiment. If humans disappeared tomorrow, what would happen to all of our infrastructure? And I forget exactly what he says about roads, but certainly the paved ones just last for an incredibly long time. Yes, some grasses pop up through the cracks in the asphalt, but certainly you come back in a few thousand years and you would still see the kind of the linear signature of that structure.
Peak roadkill in July of 1938. Do you sign off on that label as that being peak roadkill?
That's interesting. I don't actually remember that term. It's a fascinating question, right? I've thought a lot about this, right? Like how much roadkill do we see compared to some of those early road ecologists like Simmons or Dayton Stoner? I think on one hand, right, roadkill rates have gone up. There have been studies basically showing that the proportion of animals, or at least of vertebrate animals, who die by car has increased over time, over the last 50 years, basically. So if you are like a given raccoon or a possum or squirrel, you are more likely to be killed by a car now than you were 50 years ago. So in that sense, we're sort of I think we're still going towards peak roadkill in some ways. Maybe we haven't even hit it yet. But on the other hand, when it comes to the total number of animals that you see on the road dead, it's kind of fascinating to read some of the old roadkill surveys, from people like Simmons in the 1920s and 30s. They were just seeing so many critters, and not just like the like raccoons and squirrels and opossums that we see today, but dozens of red-headed woodpeckers and snapping turtles and all kinds of different animals. I do go back and read some of those early roadkill surveys and think, I feel like they're seeing a lot more animals than we are, and that could reflect a couple of different things. Maybe it's because there just were more animals back then. Maybe our wildlife populations really have declined, and we know that they have. For many species. And roadkill is part of that. obviously. So maybe those early road ecologists were seeing more animals because there were just more animals to be hit by cars back then, and so that really was peak roadkill. I also think it's possible that that there are just as many animals being killed today, but we don't see them because we go a lot faster, right? That like in the 1920s and 30s, when guys like Simmons were writing, all of these early road ecologists were just kind of like rolling along at 30 or 40 miles an hour on gravel roads in their Model Ts, whereas we're zipping along at 70 or 80 down I-90, in our F-250s, and so we just might see a lot less roadkill because we're just going so much faster, right? And I always find that striking whenever you walk or bike along a highway. You just see so many more dead animals, especially like the songbirds and the rodents, and the reptiles, the smaller critters that you just wouldn't notice, inside the cab of an SUV, racing along at 70 miles an hour. So I think maybe that's part of it too. They just saw more roadkill because they were just closer to the ground and going slower potentially.
What's something you remind yourself of when you're interviewing someone for a book project?
I have a friend named Chris Solomon, who's a fantastic outdoor and nature writer and journalist. His work I admire a lot, and I had Chris sort of speak to one of my classes last year, and he said that like the attitude that he tries to adopt both in relation to his sources and also kind of in his on-page persona is he says like the sort of the tone he's going for is the curious dumb shit. And I think that's a really good term and one that I think that I've kind of unconsciously been adopting for many years, and now that Chris kind of gave me a phrase for it, that's basically me too. I think it's the curious dumb shit, right? I always try to project curiosity, interest in, of course, in the person I'm talking to. I'm there to learn. I'm eager to learn, right? And the dumb shit piece comes in because I think that when you portray yourself as curious but somewhat ignorant, that's when you get the best answers in some ways, right? If you go into interviews thinking that you already know everything, there's this temptation that we all succumb to try to display our knowledge in conversation with our sources. Portraying yourself as curious but a little bit ignorant, I think that really gets your sources opening up and talking and voluble, which is really what you want as a writer.
That's great advice. I really like that. This would be an awesome starting point for a documentary. Do you like watching documentaries?
I'm not an enormous consumer of documentaries. I think one that I just rewatched, so it's kind of top of mind, is a film called Deer 139 that you as a hunter would also probably enjoy, which is about mule deer migration in Wyoming. And that's a lovely film that I think just kind of captures like the incredible romance and athleticism of ungulate migration, but does it through a really sort of personal lens with some really strong like lead female characters who empathize with the deer in question. I mean that's a beautiful film. But I'm not an enormous consumer of documentaries. But if some documentary filmmaker is listening to this conversation right now and it's like, oh man, road ecology, what a fantastic topic. I'm ready to take part, man.
Was there a time in this book project where you felt like you suffered for your art?
I went to a ton of places and I talked to a ton of people, and I guess I never really thought about that as suffering, right? That's what makes journalism fun, right? Is the opportunity to go to some of these fantastic places and meet some wonderful, incredibly generous people, right? That's like the kind of the really surreal thing about journalism is that you can sort of like reach out to all of these brilliant sources and be like, hey, can I tag along with you for a few days? And they, most of the time they say sure. which is just like what a great privilege. So definitely I found myself in some weird extreme places, like chasing down anteaters on the Brazilian savannah, or helping to satellite collar mule deer in the deserts of Wyoming, right? But never once did I think about that as suffering. That's just what makes what makes the job fun. Aforementioned anteaters to like watching chum salmon spawn in streams in western Washington, to sort of getting to be part of the monarch butterfly migration in Minnesota, to meeting all of these these Australian animals who'd been orphaned by cars, like wombats and wallabies. It's just like, I think that's one of the great things about this book, or one of the things that I like about it anyway as its author. It's just the rich biodiversity that's present in it, and I think the opportunity to spend time with that amazing diversity of animals, for me, that was just what made this such a fun, rewarding project.
When you go on these trips, or when you're interviewing someone on location, do you go out with like a pen and paper and you're just making notes? Do you have like an audio recorder or a camera?
Yeah, it's a good question. Definitely, in this field, I've got a tape recorder going. First, like there's just nothing like verbatim quotes and dialogue, right? That's that stuff is just so valuable, and and also I don't want to be thinking constantly about scratching down every single word that comes out of my source's mouth. I want to be present in the moment, and I also want to keep my hands free to be taking notes about what I'm not just what I'm seeing, but what I'm smelling and hearing and feeling, and and my own sort of reactions to these experiences, if all I'm doing is writing down quotes, I'm sort of numb to the world a little bit, I think. So definitely I've got a tape recorder going for sure. And then I've got my pen and paper, and that's, again, mostly I'm using that to record sensory impressions and thoughts that pop into my head in the moment. And then certainly the camera as well. Definitely really important, I think, to be taking pictures the whole time that you're in the field, because those are just really valuable. Those are just valuable resources for you, right? When you sit down a month later to write about your experience, you can use those pictures to kind of reconstruct the scene and the moment.
You met a lot of people who like spend a lot of time studying animals. I'm curious, like, what kind of personal qualities would you say are like common among that group of people?
It's pretty diverse. I think that that, look, one personality trait that I think comes up again and again, right, is optimism. I think if you're going to devote yourself to working with wildlife, look, that wildlife is declining, right? That animal populations are decreasing, that we're in the middle of this biodiversity crisis, an extinction event, that's human caused, obviously, with cars kind of at the center of it in a lot of ways. And if you're going to commit yourself to to trying to reverse those trends, I think you basically have to be a sort of a fundamentally optimistic person, right? You have to believe that your work matters, and that those negative, discouraging trends are even capable of being reversed, because otherwise, why bother, right? So I think about people like Ben Pratt, who led the campaign to build that wildlife crossing near Los Angeles over the 101, the busiest freeway on Earth, which disconnects mountain lion populations in Southern California. She spent a decade of her life, trying to get this crossing built, and certainly she wouldn't have done that if she didn't think it was possible. Another great story is that of this guy Matt Oresco, in Florida, who basically moved turtles by hand, for years across a highway until finally he was able to convince the Department of Transportation to build an underpass for this turtle population. And effectively saved these turtles, and he was out there every single day, picking up turtles and putting them in buckets and, carrying them across, 4 lanes of traffic. And I think that they're yes, they're realistic about all of the challenges that nature faces, but again, they're also fundamentally positive, optimistic people. I think who just believe that change is possible and are willing to work incredibly hard to achieve it.
Just want to thank you, Ben Goldfarb. Thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure talking to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Ron. I appreciate all your wonderful questions.
Ben Goldfarb's latest book is Crossings: How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. His previous award-winning book is Eager: The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. Thank you for listening.